Hello, everyone. My name is Magali Frenette. I'm the National Membership Success Officer at QTREC. Today, I'm joining you from Neuville in the province of Quebec. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat people. I am thrilled today to be the moderator for the panel Return to Transit, Getting People Back to Rail in Post-Pandemic World. COVID-19 has damaged transit ridership in seemingly irreparable ways, but we know that more rail is needed and more people on rail and in transit is critical. Our panelists will help us understand how that vision can become reality. Please welcome three dedicated women. Maggie Walsh, Vice President at HDR, Maya Caron, Senior Manager Risk Advisory at Deloitte, and Becca Nagorski, Director of Transit Project Planning at Metrolinx. Welcome, everyone. So we'll start today with a presentation from Becca. We'll do things a little differently, and after we'll go straight to Q&A. So questions from the audience. So please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. So I would like to keep Becca on stage to kick things off. Becca, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here with everyone and with the panel. So as Magali mentioned, I'm the Director of Transit Project Planning at Metrolinx, and that means that my job is to do the early stage planning for our for big infrastructure projects in the future, and that means that that our team has been doing a lot of looking at what do we expect the kind of long-lasting changes to be due to the pandemic. And so I'm giving a little bit of a level set from the transit agency perspective on what we're seeing in terms of pandemic recovery. Where are we now, and where do we think we're going? So I'll start with this first slide. These are actually snaps that I had on my phone from the past year and a half or so. And I bet they look pretty familiar to a lot of people and sort of show what I was thinking of as like the progression of the pandemic. So you see, that March 2020 calendar where time kind of froze, and setting up a very makeshift home office with my cat. People were very concerned about crowding in shared spaces at that time, and GTHA transit overall was at about 30 to 40% of pre-pandemic levels, with GO, which is that beautiful rainbow picture in the middle, but with no people on the platform, which is not a usual GO scenario, at 5 to 15% of pre-pandemic levels, which I think really shows the what was happening in that downtown commuter market, especially in that knowledge worker sector. As of 2 months ago, transit ridership was about 50% of pre-pandemic levels. That was looking at our Presto data, and I have that last photo, which is in Montreal, but I think kind of is similar to what the subway in Toronto looks like, where you are seeing people. It's not a lonely wasteland, but it's not back to what it used to be. And then looking forward, a survey that TTC recently did suggested that Toronto employees will be able to work from home 3.3 days per week on average. So that was looking across employers. And then, of course, and especially based on my team's position within Metrolinx, looking at progress on transit expansion for the future. And I think a big part of that story, and I won't dwell on this slide or go into the details, but is all the incredible investments that transit agencies have made over the past year and a half to help people feel more comfortable on transit. So things like air filters that no passenger is ever really going to see or know about, but that we know with an airborne virus can have a huge impact on the real concrete safety of our services, to things like mandating masks for everyone and mandating vaccines for employees. So I think our big question, and this is especially coming from my perspective and what my role is in Metrolinx, is how long lasting are these impacts going to be? So, we've been talking about the new normal for ages and ages. What do we think we're going to spring back to, and what's the timing of that? early on, a lot of people thought, this won't be long lasting. We'll have a reversion to the mean. And they looked at other big events, 9/11, for example, where people were sure that air travel would take a long-term hit, and of course it didn't. But we do think that this time changes might be longer lasting. And I thought it was really interesting that research looking at a 3-month mark as sort of a turning point for when habits become ingrained. And of course, we're way beyond that in the habit of remote work, working from home, being used to video conferencing, etc. And I think that trend that we're seeing with workplaces and employee preference to have greater workplace flexibility, more opportunity to work from home, balancing home and family, all that whole kind of universe of things that we'll get into later in the discussion here. And I think also from the employer side that firms invested in telework, in equipment, in technology, in training, and there's an opportunity for them both to build on those investments and also to shrink downtown office space and save on rent. So the next couple slides are a little bit of myth busting. And these, I have here a couple factors that people have talked about a lot as like, oh, this is definitely going to be a big change. And I'm giving a little bit of our Metrolinx evaluation on how significant we think they're going to be. So the first was a temporary decrease in immigration. We know in Canada we're an immigrant nation, and immigration is really a major fuel of our growth. And of course, in 2020, there was an almost complete cutoff of that flow, and it was a significant impact. But we see that already in 2021, that's gone back to pre-pandemic levels. And so in terms of long-term impact, we don't expect that to be a factor in how we're thinking about transit ridership in the future. Same for remote school. Well, remote school, especially in post-secondary institutions, is still prevalent. We don't expect that to endure. We see that as still kind of a tail effect of the pandemic, and so we're not imagining that that's going to be a major long-term impact on transit ridership. This next slide, though, shows two things that we do think might have some effect. So I'll actually start at the bottom, the shift in home and business location. And I've heard tons of people talking about this, that kind of stereotypical story of a family who realizes that their smaller downtown or Toronto space isn't great when everyone's at home. And so they look to move out into the country where they can have a lot more house for their money, and naturally lifestyles, I think, lend themselves more to space. And actually, when we looked at the research, we saw that this was a source of growth pre-pandemic, and that we do expect it to continue, but it's not necessarily a total pandemic trend. So we see this having some effect, but not necessarily being a major change that was spurred by the pandemic. But the last factor is remote work. So I talked about the 3.3 days a week on average. We do see that hybrid workplaces, where people are partly at home, partly in the office, is likely to be much more common. And I'll just jump to this last slide, which I think gives a sense. So that those blue bars are pre-pandemic across sectors, and the orange bars are what's anticipated post-COVID. And you can see that across sectors, there's just a major increase in telework. And so what does that mean for back to transit? I think there are definitely some positives. So transportation planners for years have been talking about travel demand management and how to make more room for on transit in the peak period, and about encouraging intermittent remote working. Well, now we've achieved that goal through different means, certainly. And so I think that's actually a really, really positive story. It means that our transit can do more for us without needing to have such a focus on mitigating overcrowding in those, even the peak 15 minutes. of a rush hour. And the other thing is, how are we thinking about planning our, projects that we're going to be building over the next 10 years? And the answer to that, certainly from a Metrolinx perspective, is yes, we're taking that into account. We're thinking about what the range of ridership might be like in a future where telework is much more common. And mostly that means how are we thinking about service planning and capacity planning in the future, and making sure that we're taking that into account and making wise decisions today for what's most likely to occur over the next 10, 20, 30 years as these projects go into operation and really are serving our region for decades to come. So with that, I'll help us transition back to the main part of our panel. I know we have a lot of questions and we're hoping to get lots of audience questions too. So I hope the other panelists will join me back.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Becca. I think it really sets the tone for this discussion to start. And welcome back, Maggie and Maya. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to get started actually with the first questions that we have. While COVID impacted every part of our globe, let's look at it from a transit perspective. What has been the impact on the return to transit, and what are the trends to watch? Becca, would you like to start, or Maya?
Maya, go ahead. I've talked a lot, so all you.
Well, I think that, so Becca used a word that I like to hear when I hear trends from a type A perspective, and that word is predictable. And I think that COVID has led to something that causes a little bit of heartburn for people who like the idea of predictable. And maybe another thing that I pulled out from your conversation is really around the amount of time that people take to make habits. And I think that the question here is really, how and if those habits that have been created over the last 18 months of the pandemic, and I think that we know sitting here today that we're not quite at the end yet. And I think that the question is really around how do we think about continuing to bring ridership back to the same levels or greater in different ways, knowing that they may not be predictable and that we have to think about new trends. And so when I think about that, I look around the globe and I see a lot of news articles that I'm sure that many of you have, and they all say the same thing. In New York, Australia, Montreal, Toronto, there's calls to action around road congestion returning before transit ridership returns, as the public makes different decisions about how they'll travel to work, to school, to shop, and for leisure. I think the use of any non-privately owned solution is down, and health and safety continues to be top of mind as strong drivers, as people think about how they're going to move when they step out of their door. And so I was trying to think about what signals we can look for to identify trends or help us to understand riders. And what I did is I went to a State of the Consumer survey that Deloitte produces. And because I have this type A personality, I like to look for the trends. And the good news is that they've been recurring this consumer survey monthly through the pandemic to sort of watch the trends. And I noticed something really interesting around the last publication, and it's that people are starting to rethink their lifestyle choices. And so that's really interesting because we talked about patterns and how long it takes to make patterns. And so they're thinking about how they work, how freely they spend their money. And so that just talks about the types of things that they'll think about doing and how quickly they're throwing what we'll call pandemic caution to the wind. So that is really around social gatherings. Are they thinking about moving in their leisure time? And what are they thinking about doing during that time? So what we're seeing is that younger people are showing that they're less risk adverse, which is not that surprising, are more likely to be spending more time out of the house, more trusting of people they don't know, more likely to move. people in sort of the mid-range, which I would count myself in, up to 55, are most likely to be sticking with this new digital behavior where they may not be seeking in-person interactions. And so we can translate all of that into transit ridership. So compared to 12 months ago, today, people are feeling home-centric, but they're seeking in-person interaction and looking to rebuild social trust. They're valuing today with time. They're looking to balance experiences and things, so it means that they're not looking to stay home. They're looking for a greater focus on well-being and purpose. So I just think when I look at the trends we're seeing from a customer and a consumer perspective, we can really translate some of that to the way we're thinking about moving and thinking about going to travel. So we have these work at home patterns. We have employers telling people that they have to return to the office or suggesting that their offices might be open depending on where you live and who your employer is. But the consumer feeling is the one that I go back to when I think about how people are thinking about returning to transit. So those are the trends that I'm looking to. Maggie, Becca, any additional trends that you'd like to layer on to that?
Go ahead, Becca.
The one that I would add on is what I thought was so interesting about this, where we often talked about how this was one of the first major global events in a lot of our lifetimes, where everyone around the world was going through the same thing at the same time. But at the same time, it's been very, very local. I shouldn't say past tense. It's really very much present tense, where depending on what city you're in, certainly country by country, where we've had different waves, restrictions have been different. I think communities and sort of within our local societies have had different communal risk tolerances, and so of course those all play out on transit. So how comfortable people feel coming back to transit and when they feel comfortable, how vaccination campaigns have interplayed with return to transit, and what that's meant also for us as transit workplaces, on the flip side of that, and certainly generally with returning to offices and health and safety measures. So that's been something on my mind, just making sure that we're sort of taking trends from place to place and extrapolating and understanding what we can learn from other cities, but also identifying what we really need to be paying attention to local factors for, and not assuming that Toronto is going to be the same as Vancouver and Seattle and some of our typical comparators, where sometimes that may apply, sometimes it may not.
It's interesting because when I listen to the two of you talk, and you talk about, consumer confidence and where that's going to be, and you talk about the local patterns and what will drive decisions at that local level. I've been thinking about the words return to transit, and I have been looking at what's happening around the globe, and governments are investing in building new, expanding, maintaining existing transit entities all over the world. So what I'm looking at in the trends is that there's investment happening. The money is there. And we're seeing, even Minister Ma said yesterday morning, hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in transit infrastructure all across the world. In fact, Becca's living it right now at Metrolinx with major programs that are on the world arena and in the limelight. We're seeing, in the United States, there's something small happening. Well, it's not that small. $1.2 trillion is being invested in an infrastructure bill. It's a very exciting time to be in the United States. And also, I just got back from Israel, and in Israel, they're investing billions of dollars to put a brand new 3-line subway under the city of Tel Aviv. So there is a major investment that's happening. And why? It's because it's socially right, it's equitably right, it's improving mobility. It's giving people choices and really enhancing the quality of our lives. So I think that this return to transit, there's a lot of good to be thinking about, and I think that's going to lead us into a few more of our questions and answers. Magali?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing those trends and also enlightening the fact that, yeah, government is pouring money into this whole adventure right now. So thank you very much. And so what can we learn from the differing response and recovery experience across different cities, region, and countries? You just talked about Israel, but what else can we see?
I can jump in with a couple of trends that we've seen from the Metrolink side in Toronto. So I think we're seeing we're seeing a lot more off-peak travel, and we're seeing a need to invest in off-peak travel for either essential workers who don't have a 9 to 5 schedule, who have different schedules. We're also seeing an increase and a willingness of people to return to transit for leisure travel, even if they're not ready to return for a rush hour. So we saw this, we had a big promotional campaign to promote our service to Niagara or to other rail service on weekends that takes people to more leisure destinations. I think flexibility, of course, is another one, and that goes back to Maya's predictability. They kind of go hand in hand a little bit. And then I think information, like people need to know what safety measures are in place. They need to have that certainty that they can count on transit, especially if they're new or they're taking a trip that they're not used to taking. So those are sort of best practices. We've known for years that those are important, and they're extra important now.
Maybe I would just layer on to that. We talked about regions recovering differently, and I think we know that public health measures are different across the world. But it's interesting that you talk about the way that leisure travel is returning in Metrolinx's area of influence, because we are actually seeing that same picture emerge elsewhere. So for instance, in the UK, London public transport usage is actually back to what it was before on the weekends. But during the week, it's only 55% of current usage. So I think that's really interesting to think of. People are traveling on the weekends, they're going about living their lives, but their work patterns have changed. And so we're not seeing the same ridership during the week in London. And as an anecdote, I've heard that it's public sector workers that are actually the ones that are largely not coming back in London as they return to the office. And so I'm not sure if that speaks to public sector requirements or mandated days in the office in the UK, but it's interesting to see the type of workers that are staying home. But I think that maybe looking at what's happening globally, and I would say that there's definitely this same feeling around weekday travel not returning to normal. But I think that I'd like to go back to some of Maggie's comments around investment, and I would link them back to some of the things that we have been seeing coming out of Australia. And so I think it's around the idea of getting the investment right. And so when I say that, I think that I mean making sure that people feel like we're spending our dollars and really getting the transit systems, the ridership levels that we're hoping to get. And I think that there's some great learnings that we can take globally to help us to get there. And I think that if we get those things right, they help to build that trust that people are looking for in the transit system, trust in the government that they're going to be providing a service that people want to be able to move around, whether it's just on the weekend, whether it's during the day, and whatever their new work patterns are. And so a good example is thinking more during the planning and development phases, and that's something that came out of Australia around systems end-to-end thinking really early on. So making sure that operational knowledge is embedded into the planning and development and design phases, making sure that we're doing things to think about how things will work once they're in operation earlier in the project. So those are some early learnings from that we've had from previous investment projects that we can make now as we expand transit in North America, and help to instill that trust that people have, so that when the systems start working, when those investments come into play, then people have that trust. And maybe the other thing I would look to around investment is it's not just investment in new infrastructure, it's really also investment in frequency and people having trust in a service that is there for when they want it. And so I was really interested to see earlier this year, the Ontario Ministry of Transportation published a discussion paper that suggested that a 10-minute transit service and a 10-minute bus service would be one that would work well in the Toronto area, and that would be what our sort of North Star was. And I think that that it's really interesting to think about that trust in service. So knowing that you're walking out the door and you get to a train or a bus and that it will come, and it will come quickly no matter what time of day. And these are really great things that we can do as we start to plan for investing and returning to travel. But I think that getting to that level of service, particularly in the Toronto area, requires a lot of investment, and it requires us to think about how we can invest well. So these are not new ideas.
Maya,
Yeah.
as while you're talking about all that, what's coming to mind now is the need for riders and users to really plan out their trips, right? So something that we're learning is that they need the trust, and that their service that they want will be there, but also guidance, and maybe the need to use their phones to plan out their entire trip. And this conference that we're speaking at, has a lot of dialogue around smart technology. And I think we can look at the smart technology in the big areas of autonomous vehicles or hydropower and all these other technologies, but we also can bring it right back to the user experience and the need that that we are creating an infrastructure that also has a way to learn how to use it in an effective way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other thoughts on that subject before we jump to the other question? Okay, great. So would you discuss some of the significant transformation that you're seeing in the transit industry for each of these? How have they been shaped by the pandemic? Maybe Maya, would you start on that question, or Becca? Really up to you.
I was going to go to Maggie, but maybe I'll just say that I don't think that I wouldn't call it a transit transformation. What I would say is that I don't want the vehicle market to overcome transit ridership, and so I hope that we don't get there. So when I think about transformations that I'm seeing in the transit industry, I think that we can go back to some of those. Like for me, what I do is I go back to some of that customer sentiment. And the same consumer trend survey that I mentioned earlier talks about a few drivers of mobility. And at the same time that we're thinking around what is driving mobility, what makes it easy, people at home were getting used to this personalized, responsive customer experience that they get by all the virtual interactions that they're having. And so when I think about that, transportation agencies were in the process of making their mobility systems pre-COVID more seamless, sustainable, accessible, affordable, safe. That's not new. they were already starting to do that. So to me, there's sort of this convergence of what we were trying to achieve before and this new customer that is expecting a personal, responsive customer experience when they get out the door. And so when I think about digital transformations, I think that we can go back to that combination of that digital revolution that we were seeing before, the creation of these seamless, sustainable, accessible, and safe systems, and then look at the potential to accelerate some of that work as we recover. And so I know that we've talked a lot about changing travel patterns, and maybe one thing that I would mention that a lot of people have heard of, so also won't be new, is the idea of digital twins. And so having a system that can help transit agencies embrace a more agile approach to planning and implementation, and really start to understand and move quickly to help to make decisions, recognizing that now we have greater flexibility that's required in the planning and scheduling and routing. Now, to be able to do that, to create these perfect copies of the world, we need data, we need to connect governments and create other partnerships that may not be in place today. And really the whole intent is to capture and utilize data that represents a system that's already there. So when I think about things that I would like to do faster now, that's one of the things that I think about, and maybe look to Becca or Maggie for what else they'd like to see.
I bet we could set up Becca here for a quick second with transformational, industry. Well, I appreciated, just what the word transformational means. But, we can't stop. We have to keep building this infrastructure. And Becca is in a leading organization in the Greater Toronto area to do just that. And I know we appreciate the coffee chat that Phil Burster had with Josipa earlier yesterday morning in really amplifying the amazing things that Metrolinx is doing. So Becca, we'd love to hear more on the reasons why we can't stop. Keep going.
That was quite a setup, Maggie. Thank you. And I think I appreciated you giving the global perspective on this. That I think Toronto is happily for the rest of the world not alone, but especially early on in the pandemic, we were getting a lot of questions about should we even be doing this, and those were probably some of our darkest and most uncertain moments. But from the Metrolinx side, it was a clear decision to keep going full steam ahead, push our projects as fast as we can push them to delivery, with tunnel boring machines arriving and construction starting, and certainly a lot happening on the back end in terms of bids and getting people on board to do the right work. From our view, we certainly need to plan for what the long lasting effects of the pandemic might be, and I spoke a little bit to that, in particular the long-term effects of work from home, or how that will play out in the coming 10, 20, 30 years. And we're doing that with all of the technical tools that we have, our ridership forecasting tools, and our sensitivity testing, and our risk analysis, and all of the things that I'm sure all of you in this session would be familiar with. But those are about how to build or how to modify or how to build the projects to our new reality, not whether we should be continuing investment, whether we should be building. I think that was an unequivocal yes. We know that the Toronto region is growing today. It will continue to grow, and so investing in transit is what we need for the economic vitality that we need to continue building for, and all of the kind of the connections that we have so missed over the past year and a half, and we know people will want to return to.
Honestly, I think that that's one of the best things that I've come through this pandemic. I think that what I love is that we're not losing momentum, that you see in the US, in Canada, elsewhere, people continuing to invest, acknowledging that the construction projects need to keep going forward. And so for me, that's what gives me sort of the hope and knowledge that the governments understand how important transit is. And certainly QTRIX had many discussions with our current government about the need for investment. And I think that having all of the transit agencies come together at a table and talk about that was what helped to elevate that conversation. And so I think it needs to continue moving ahead.
Well,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Maya, for bringing it up. Maggie, did you want to add something on that?
Nope, just a well said point by Maya.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And maybe let's take a moment and reflect on the human aspect and how has the pandemic affect riders? Will and how will people naturally move to modes of transport and maybe even more green modes of transit? Maybe I'll start with you, Maggie.
I can just pick up here based on just even the things that we've been talking about. The fact that this is an economic engine, this is a quality of life, this is a way of life. It's and what's interesting that Becca said earlier is this leisure space that people who may not depend on it all the time but want to use it to get to concerts or to get to a park, or I think even Phil Verster said that there's an encouragement to take the trains to 12 beautiful parks in the Greater Toronto area. So I think what we're seeing is that transit leaders in both public and private sectors are really trying to look at what that human behavior needs to look like going forward, and what kind of services are they going to really want that makes them feel safe and happy to be using the systems. One of the things that Josipa always says is that her dream is to see that transit is, well, I'll say super appealing. She'll use different words to really encourage the use and the importance of transit. So one of the things that we were able to do in the pandemic is kind of just take a step back and just breathe for a moment and say, okay, we need to clean up a bit, right? We need to clean our trains, and we need to make them a place where you don't feel dirty all the time. We need to enhance the lighting everywhere, and both indoors and outdoors. We just have to think about the entire experience for what's happening. And I believe that this has been a hot topic for many of the transit leaders to just take some time and think about what it is that we have a moment here. We need to keep going, but what do we need to do to regain or continue to obtain ridership confidence? So that's some of the thoughts that I had on my mind.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Becca, would you like to add on that, since you have your hands full of what's happening right now at Metrolinx and the ridership? So
yeah, absolutely. For me, transportation, and I'm speaking more as myself with like what I feel is really my professional calling is options for people, right? You want people to not feel like the only choice they have is to get into their car, and we know that comes from land use, and we know that comes from good infrastructure, wide sidewalks where people are happy to walk down, bike infrastructure. And we've certainly in Toronto seen a major expansion in cycling infrastructure. And I'd give a warm shout out to our colleagues at the City of Toronto for that, for sure. And lots of willingness to take bold measures during the pandemic to put in pilot projects. That I think that was one of the coolest things that we saw. We have seen a big uptick in cycling, and you see that, if you go to your local bike shop and try to order a new bicycle and you find like you're facing a major back order because cycling is so has become so desirable. I wish that it hadn't taken people not feeling safe on transit to try out cycling, but you know what? Sometimes trying something out for a not great reason makes you see, yeah, this is also an option. I'm going to add it to my toolbox. And chipping away at that, person by person is I think the way to expand travel options for everyone. And there's certainly a virtuous cycle there where more demand amongst cyclists and pedestrians leads to more investment in infrastructure, and more investment in active transportation infrastructure is great for transit too, because it means that people can access our stations more easily. So I think I wouldn't say no to any of it. I'm happy for people to have the right options they need to make the trips they need to make.
I love that you talk about cycling, because it's something that's close to my own heart. And it reminds me, Becca, of a story I heard around in Munich, where they are embracing this idea of creating micro hubs. And really it's about these, I'll use the word micro again, but tiny changes to existing stations, just to make understand those human transitions that people need. So cognitive things that people need to make access easier. And so I'll share some of the examples from the story that I heard, because I really liked how tiny these changes were. So it was really just about looking at existing stations and making sure that spaces were easy to get to, moving the bus stop so that it actually stopped at the door, making sure that the cycling parking was covered, and that you had actually considered cognitive movement in the development of your new design. So it's really all around this these micro changes that are in place, and these minor changes that were really just around thinking about cognitive movement. In Leamington in the UK, actually tripled cycling to the station. And so I just thought that was such a measurable statistic. When you think about making these small changes, even at existing stations, to make it easier for people to think about how else they're getting to the station, and then maybe they're more likely to ride for the next part of their journey on the train. I just think that was such an interesting thought. And for me, I like the idea of making micro changes because it's easy. You're not asking people to make major changes to their travel patterns when we're already talking about, significant changes that have happened in our world, in our space.
Yeah, absolutely. These are just minimal actions that can be done and will change the complete kind of ecosystem around it. So that's great. Thank you very much. I have another question, actually. In looking at the role of employers in space of returning to work, many are assessing the right approach. What's on your mind around this topic? Maggie, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, this is an interesting topic, around what employers are trying to do to encourage returning to work. And part of that has to do with how they return to work, right? Using our transit systems or our car or what have you. And so I think that there's some challenges. We're still in the middle of this pandemic. It's still driving our decisions. And so I think that there's a constant need to have open dialogues with all employees. Say, where's the comfort level? But we do know that human interaction does make a difference when you are working on whatever it is that you're doing. That you continue to learn, and you continue to build your skills, and you continue to have a way to make informed decisions. And sometimes you can't just always do that from your living room or your kitchen, right, Maya? So I think that this is a conversation that has a lot of sensitivity around it. One thing that's been on my mind while we've been going through all these questions is that I keep thinking about the career space of what this industry can be for more people. And I think when I hear, my esteemed panel members talk about options and talk about different mode use, let's reach out to our youth and let them know that all of these things that you're using, the bikes and the trains and what have you can be a future career for them. And maybe really engaging this space of, reminding them that this is a great topic. I mean, a great place to build a career. You're influencing the way you work, where you play, where you live. And I think that that's something that we could also look at in the space of returning to transit. It's actually it could be and should be a growth industry for jobs, new jobs, technology jobs, but really engage the youth in that and let them know that this is something for them.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Becca, would you like to say a few words on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked a ton about the implications of a more flexible work model on transit. I don't claim to have any expertise on this other than, being, as Maggie kind of alluded to, more, a director within Metrolinx with my own team to worry about it. And you're happening to catch us on our first week of our hybrid workplace back in the office. So, Monday I was in the office, yesterday I was at home, today I'm back in the office. And we're all sort of in this moment of trying this out and seeing what it's like and reassuring our teams. And, I think as Maggie talked about, like checking in with people, what do you want? How are the options working for you? I think my observation and some of the things I've seen are flexibility is good, but a free for all is actually stressful for people. So giving some parameters around what the expectations are is actually useful. Although remains to be seen, maybe in the end people will prefer total flexibility, or I think people will sort by workplace. So if complete flexibility is the most important thing to you, you'll pick your employer based on that, and vice versa. So I guess my overall message is like, this is a time to really be paying attention, both within our own industry and our own offices, and then also for what the implications are for our work and for the transportation that we're building and operating.
Yeah, and Maya, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'll use a line that I know Maggie likes, and it's moments that matter. And it seems like something small, but it's something that's really stuck around in my own mind. And it's really about, as people return to work, thinking about how and when they'll do it and giving them some kind of framework to work within. How do I decide when I know when I should be in the office and when I know that I should could consider working somewhere else? And when I think about it, that idea of moments that matter, I think that when you think about the office, you have to think about workplaces being office spaces that are critical to corporate culture, that are places that foster belonging. It's not about providing a desk. It's about creating a space and a culture. And so forging connections, creating community, being at the office when you have a team meeting, and maybe spending your time in the office making purposeful connections rather than at a desk are the times that people think about coming in. And so I think that as employers thinking about all of their employees returning to the office, I think that they could think about helping to frame when employees can start coming back around these moments that matter. And so that's one thing that I think about around the role of employers in returning to work. But there's something else that I'd like to think about, maybe two other things. One is that when I go back to Becca's myth busting, not every rider is an office worker. In fact, not that many riders are office workers. And many are still working, or they might not be traveling because their jobs in the town core don't exist anymore because there's not a glut of office workers that are already there for them. So the one thing I do want to make sure we're always talking about when we're thinking about return to ridership is that not everyone is a 9-to-5 rider, and I think that it's important that we're taking that holistic view. And I know that most transit agencies have already gotten there. But when I think about what employers can do, I just want to add one other thing in, because I think that employers have a great moment of leadership that they could be taking at this moment around helping their employees thinking about how they move as they come back into the office. And so I think that that's the other layer. It's not only a personal decision. There are things that employers and cities can do together to help people think about making climate-friendly choices as they travel back to work. And there's a great example that you can look up that actually started pre-pandemic, but it's one that I love called the Lisbon Mobility Pact. And the reason that I like it is because the word pact says it all. It's an agreement. It's not written in stone. All that it is a public grouping of businesses and employers and municipalities that came together with a common ambition to improve mobility in Lisbon. And they just chose from a list of actions that said that they would do, including convincing their employees or thinking of ways to engage their employees in choosing more sustainable choices as they choose to travel and be mobile and work together. And so when I think of roles of the employer, I think that we as employers can be thinking about things that we can do to support mobility in the transit industry and in helping our employees come back to the office.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I'd like to go back. Maybe we talked about investment, but we also talked about ways to improve our trains, our infrastructure, to increase ridership. And one of the questions we got from the audience is, do you have any concerns that government rebates for electric cars will encourage people to buy them instead of using transit? Maybe I'll start with you, Becca, since you work at Metrolinx, so you're deep down into it.
Thanks for starting with me on that one. So that's actually a little bit outside of my area of focus. I think I can't say much more other than I think, governments have a really complicated portfolio to balance in terms of, climate objectives and transit and different policies that meet different goals. And that feels to me like part of it, but I'm actually not so familiar with the research on how subsidies might interplay with transit use. I wonder if Maggie or Maya has seen any research on that.
Maggie, do you have any
I haven't seen
insights?
any research on it, and I think it's certainly top of mind when we're thinking about automobiles and their use. I think this is where land use planning will support alternative uses of transit. There are some people that will not get out of their cars. We get that is a fact. But I think there's a growing population of people valuing options. Maya?
I think providing options is really the key, Maggie. I agree with that. I think that electric vehicles are still expensive, and I think when you compare them today to the cost of a transit ticket, I think you'll make an economic decision around which one might be lower cost. But I think in the end, it comes back to that helping consumers make choices as they step out of their door. And that's what I think about. And so if I have an electric car, that's great, but what will be the easiest, most convenient way for me to travel when I get out of the door? And sometimes that might be transit. Sometimes that might be my electric vehicle. I do think that it's an interesting question around consumers that value climate as their highest objective, and they might choose electric. I know there's a conversation today around electric and the carbon benefits of electric really being tied to what goes into your electric grid. So I think that there's work to be done there to better understand which one of those choices is the right choice. And I don't have any more information than that, but I think that it's something that we will have to think about as we move ahead.
Yeah, and we've had another question kind of related to that, and it's all about road pricing. And what do speakers think about road pricing as a fundamental part of return to transit market condition realities? Because most of the people say, no, we don't want that, but would it still be a good solution? Maggie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I totally understand the question. Do you want to try to rephrase it again?
Yeah, absolutely. Without road pricing, there's no punitive measure to reshape the habit of car driving in return to transit. What do you think about road pricing as a fundamental part of the return to transit market condition?
I mean, is it road pricing? Is it congestion pricing? Is it, I think it's, oh, you could look at this in so many different ways. There's different reasons for, putting tolls or pricing measures out there because we have to pay for this infrastructure, whether it is a road or something related to transit. So I don't know if I'm equipped to fully answer some of this. I think, again, it's these are great questions with a lot of minds that have to put some energy behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Maya, would you have any ideas about that question, or is it too out of your scope?
I wouldn't call it in my scope, but I think that many people have opinions on road pricing, and I think that from my perspective, I think now is the time to help people to choose transit instead of their vehicle. And I think as governments consider policies that could be put in place to encourage that, I think that's one of the options on the list that can be considered. And I don't think it matters if it's something that we thought about 5 years ago and dismissed at that time. I think it's fine to bring it back and think about it in the current landscaping and make a decision around that. We're in a new time. We're making new decisions, and we have different information available to us.
Yeah, and Becca, what are your thoughts about that?
I think I'd say similar to Maggie and Maya. A lot of considerations around road pricing. We're certainly at a moment where I think there's some openness to considering bold choices. But I'd also say I think we're in thinking about how we're supporting economic recovery. We're also in this space of how can we help people. So thinking about new transit fare concessions, new ways to make new positive incentives. I'm hearing more enthusiasm for those kind of policies rather than on the congestion pricing. But I certainly think that it's clearly that this is clearly a topic where there's both technical and professional input needed, but also it's a decision in a democracy for our elected officials, and so certainly those considerations we can't ignore those, and that's also always going to be important in that kind of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've had a great conversation so far. So any last thoughts before I let you go? If you have any closing remarks, that would be great. I'll start with you, Maggie.
Sure. So, the three of us would just like to leave you with a few takeaways from the messages that we were trying to share with you today. So for me, governments, private industry, they all see the critical importance of transit. And it's evident by their continued investment in significant levels across the globe. The pandemic changed us to think outside the box, to be more nimble, and to really maybe even react a little bit more quicker than we might have had in the past. Maya?
For me, I just want to say, we're in a climate emergency. We don't have time to wait to see how people will return to work and when they're comfortable to do so. For me, it's about doubling down on transit and taking this time to use our opportunity to be human, use technology to address the human needs for safety, and think about partnerships and different ways that employers can have a role in helping their employees return to transit.
And I'll be really, really quick because I know we're at time. I'm kind of in the I can't wait to see what happens next space. We're in this period of immense transformation. We need to pay attention to that, be responsive, be adaptive, listen to our customers, listen to our staffs and our teams, and adapt and do the best that we can to meet emerging needs.
Well, thank you very much. Those are great comments to close this session. Thank you so much for joining me today as we discuss how to get people back to rail in post-pandemic world. And thanks again to our great panelists, Maggie, Maya, and Becca. Thank you very much. It was an honor to moderate your panel. Please make sure to join us in the next sponsored keynote session with Ballard at 4:30, and stay tuned for the second Smart Rail Technology Conference closing speeches at 5. Thank you very much, and see you very soon. Thank you.